We're going to take a look at autumn paintings, and I got a number of them here. Different artists from different time periods, different schools of painting. You know, they're all autumn, they all have a lot of color in them, but they don't have much in common beyond that, because they're different styles, different views of how to approach painting. But one thing they all have in common is the idea of what makes a good painting. They're composed well based on ideas of composition we always talk about. They're simplified by finding shadow pattern, simplifying the large masses, breaking them down to as few large shapes as possible. The idea that you want to break a painting down to 4 to 8 shapes and then find the right value in those shapes and then start to break it up. And they all do that. They all have the same idea of color and light, using color temperature more than local color. In other words, it doesn't matter what color this artist used to get this green. What matters is that it looks sunlit. The color is just a choice. To make it look sunlit, he has to have the right value and the right temperature. So let's get started and look at these guys. This is T.C. Steele, painter from Indiana, turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. You get a sense of a lot of detail, especially in here. All these artists simplified real well, but the paintings have a sense of detail in it here, just by all this variation of color. Some detail in here, but even the trees have a sense of detail to them. But it isn't detail like we think of, where you're just picking little darks and lights, trying to paint every leaf, every blade of grass. The detail here is suggested by broken color. He sets up the composition well. He has big, large shapes, big, simple values. Values are not complicated. They look complicated because he has so much going on in here, but it's not detail. It's not really value changes. If we look at this in black and white, you can see there's 2, maybe 3 values in the background trees, and maybe 3 values, maybe 4 with 2 darks, 2 lights in these foreground darker trees. But you see, value-wise, which is what detail is, it's a lot of breaking up into smaller darks and lights. That's detail. But if you just break up the color, like he's done here in this foreground area, same value, but 2 or 3 or 4 different colors. And that's all he's done here. The black and white shows how simple the values and shapes are. It's his use of color here, breaking it up into same value, different colors, subtle color changes in these large areas. And you got one shape for the sky or for the water, shape for this flat area here, a shape for this flat area, one large shape for the trees, mountains, sky. So he's broken it down into really nice, big, simple shapes. And when you do that, you get simple values. Or you can use simple values. That way, color is a lot easier. It's a lot easier to come up with this nice color variation when you have simple shapes, simple values. And he's also probably thinking a color range. The grasses, he wants that from a yellow orange, yellow green, even some violets and reds and red oranges in there. But he's thinking in terms of color groups as he's breaking them up. This is more of dark oranges, maybe some red violets in here. The whole idea is to simplify. And he keeps his brush strokes pretty big and simple. There's no fancy brush work here. It's just a matter of putting it in. He does come back and mess with edges quite a bit. He's got a nice variety of hard and soft edges. But that's T.C. Steele. This is Aldro Hibbard. He was an East Coast painter. Around the turn of the century, mostly 1920s, 30s was his heyday. Although this is not East Coast. I think this is Colorado, which he did not do much painting outside of the Cape Ann area or Vermont. Or Gloucester, but he did here. This is painted similar to T.C. Steele's painting, big, simple masses. And again, if we look at this in black and white, you can see how simple the shapes are. He does have some value change down in here at the bottom, in the light areas, some value changes in here, which is detail. but a lot of it's bigger, simpler, flatter areas. And a lot of the values are real similar, something that you really can't get away with in the summertime or springtime. The sky value here, the light on the mountain, the light on the trees, light on the ground, all pretty much the same value, which really flattens out the painting. It flattens it out in the black and white version. But because it's autumn and there's just an extreme jump in intensity from this yellow to this violet, warm violet, to this blue, and then the green down here. It's that intensity difference, yellow against the violet, against the blue, against the green, that makes it look like different values. But when we look at it in black and white, there's not much of a value change here, or between there and the sky. So you can use, in the autumn colors, use that intensity of the colors to break up the shapes value-wise. And again, it's not value, it's intensity that separates the planes. And you can't get away with that very often, but in autumn you can. Now this is John Folensby. He painted in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s. His later paintings in 40s and 50s became more regional looking, almost abstract. But his early paintings I really, really like. Now, he used small, tiny brush strokes. If I painted like this, in art school, my teacher would have told me, come on, use bigger brush strokes, get big, solid masses in there. And he'd be right. That's a good way to learn first. But once you understand the rules of what makes good composition, simple value, shapes, color, you can apply the paint any way you want. Because this painting holds together because he has big, simple shapes and values, sky, mountains, or trees in the background, water, the trees here, and the sunlight and shadow here. So he's got about 5 or 6 large shapes. So he's kept the shapes very simple. And he also has kept the values simple. When we look at this in black and white, there's real close values between the sky, background trees, and water. And close values between the shadow on the ground and shadow on the trees. So that does flatten it out a little bit. When we look at it in the color, it's that warm against cool, warm sky against cool trees that separates them. So you can use temperature to separate the planes if you have real strong temperature contrast, because the values aren't very strong here. But again, you can see the values are very simple. So if you can simplify your subject, big shapes, simple values, apply it any way you want. As a matter of fact, it's a good idea to experiment. Use a palette knife, a tiny palette knife, a big one. Use small brushes, big brushes. Try to apply the paint in different manners so you can see the effect. But what makes the painting work is not the brush work. It's the big masses, simple shapes, simple values, use of warm and cool temperature. But you can see in the black and white, the values, not a lot of values in here, but there is a lot of color. A lot of color variation in the leaves, in the grasses, even in the sky. He's got about 4 different colors in that sky. All pretty much the same value, so it doesn't stand out as picky detail. Now there's some value changes in the trees, but when you look at it in black and white, there really isn't value change. It's more color. Same value, different color. And that creates a vibration within this big area of the foliage, big area of the water. Because again, we look at the water, it's all the same value, pretty much. There's a lot of variation of color that gives it that vibration, that warm against the cool. And that's why he uses the small brush strokes, so we can place one color next to another. Same value, or real close to that value. And let me know if that makes sense. You can create excitement and color and vibration without making it look like detail. And that's, again, same value in an area, but different colors. And all these guys do that, but they all apply the paint differently. Now this is also John Folensby, same guy. He was also a student of John Carlson. He painted with Carlson at Woodstock when Carlson taught there and painted a lot there. And you can see the similarities. If you've ever seen some color paintings by Carlson, his book is all black and white. But if you Google his name, you can see a lot of his color paintings. But again, we look at this black and white, and the values become very simple. Shapes become real simple. And it's a really simplified painting. It's just that idea of, within this light area, he's got 5, maybe 6 colors. This light area, I don't know if you can see where my thing is going right there. There's 5 or 6 colors there, so it looks busy and has excitement to it. But the fact that it's pretty much one value, it simplifies it. And that's what makes all this work, is the values are simple, but he breaks things up with a lot of different colors. The shadow on the ground from the horse and the tree, you can see, has a ton of color in it. But in the black and white, maybe 2 values. I could possibly get 3 out of there, but not much value change at all. He also has a lot of backlit subjects. With backlit subjects, you have strong, warm and cool contrast. Even though this tree is in shadow, it's real warm, because even a cool yellow is going to be real warm compared to the blue distance value back in there. Shadow on the ground, because again it's backlit, we're looking into the sun, so the shadows come towards us. The real cool shadows against the real warm sunlight. But it's that simplification of everything that matters. And all these guys do that. They have a way of simplifying their subject, but then applying the paint in such a way that makes it kind of distinctive for them. Now the next artist here, this is E. Martin Hennings. It's not a great image, but again, his painting works because of the simplicity, even though he has some areas of detail, like this area in here has some detail in it, the foliage, some detail in the figures and the horses. But everything is big and simple. But what draws you into it, color-wise, again, is the strong contrast, warm and cool color in the yellows, dark and light between tree trunks and the shadow, and focusing the detail here in the focal point. But the lead-in into this painting is pretty obvious. The line here in the grass, which is subtle, but then it hits the dog, which hits the leg of the Indian and up the tree, and then it just winds all around. It just carries your eye all over the place in this painting. Very well designed. Sometimes you can over-design a painting and it looks too obvious, but I don't think this is too obvious. It's very well designed. And this really doesn't have a sense of a lot of detail, but it looks very finished, and mainly because the broken color. You can see value-wise these shapes are big, simple, and the values are really simple. It's that color, variation of color he has in the grass. Doesn't have much variation in the foliage. Does in the tree trunk. I've seen this one in person. It's in Oklahoma. A lot of color variation in this tree trunk, but the tree trunk is one value. And it makes it read really simple. But you can have color variation in there and have a bit more excitement color-wise. But he has no need to add a bunch of detail in here. I mean, there is some detail, but not overworked at all. Now, this is a painting by Charles Movelli. He was an East Coast painter. But if you're ever familiar back in the 70s and 80s with the painting books by Emile Groupé, who was an East Coast painter in Gloucester, Massachusetts, Charles Movelli was his editor, kind of writer, helped him write those books. He helped write a lot of other art books as well, but he was a really good painter. And this is done in acrylic. He switched to acrylic like the last 15, 20 years or so. His acrylics look like oils. But what he does in a lot of his paintings is he keeps the darks very simple. He doesn't do much into the darks. There's a big cloud shadow here, and it's a very simple value. No detail, no little darks and lights in there. Of course, that's far away. You can say, well, it's in the distance. Nobody would put a lot of detail there, but the darks here, they become just a big shape, simplified shape in here. Not much variation, same thing in here. And he keeps all his work, busy work, whether it's small brush work or detail, different value changes, he keeps that all in the light. He also pushes warm and cool a lot. I doubt that hills back here were this color. I don't necessarily know that trees were this yellow and orange or, whatever colors they were. he pushes it so he's got that kind of blue-violet, yellow-orange complementary combination going there. And the reds in the shadows, greens in the grass. He really pushes complementary colors and also warm and cool temperatures. And it makes his paintings really strong. And you can see his detail is very, very suggested. You could probably cut this area out and not know what it is, but in relation to everything else, it really works well. And shadows always had a lot of color in them, even though they might be dark, like in here. Very colorful. There's no black in his shadows. Not that it's necessarily wrong to use black, but when you want color, it doesn't help very much. Now this is a painting by Herbert Dunton. He was a Taoist painter. Again, early 20th century. A lot of his work is very stylized. It has a very definite look to it. So it's very well designed. And again, you can see what he's thinking compositionally. Your eye, and the viewer's eye, you always want the viewer to enter at the bottom of the painting. So he has a definite sharp edge here of light against dark, which creates a line that your eye follows the sharp line between the elk and the dark tree, and then hits these yellow trees and just winds all the way up in here and comes back down. It can just carry all over in here because it's so well designed. Your eye moves through it instead of just running off the canvas. There's no lines that go from one end or one side to the other or from top to bottom. They always flow back into the painting and around and should bring you back to the front again. And again, you can do it to where it looks too obvious, too designed. And this one might be a little designed, but it's on purpose. It's a definite style he wants to use. But again, his work is very distinctive, his brushwork, but what's the same in his work and all these artists' work is the use of good principles of composition value, color temperature, edges, things like that. Now, he doesn't mess with variation of edges because he wants a little more of that flat design look, which he gets here. It's kind of sharp edges a lot in the trees. Not a big variation of hard and soft edges from the foreground to the background. It's a bit more on purpose. Now this is Clarence Gagnon. This is in France. And again, we look at this and we get our eyes caught up in these color variations. And if we're thinking about painting this way, that's the first thing we think is, gosh, how do I come up with this color and then that color and then this color and all these little colors in here? You know, I could never do that. I could never think of those colors. But if this artist, Clarence, was to repaint this painting, it would look totally different. Well, not totally, but it would look different. He wouldn't come up with the same colors because it isn't that planned. What he does plan is the simple shapes, the dark shapes here on the right, the light shapes here kind of in the middle, darker shapes here on the left side, shape of the ground, water, reflection in the water. You know, again, that 6, 7 large masses. Then after that, he thinks temperature. You know, cooler oranges and yellows over here, warm yellows, cooler blue-greens. That doesn't mean you're going to come up with the same color every time you think blue-green. But what matters is getting the value right and the temperature right. So he's not thinking in terms of a formula of having to have these colors in the shadow of a yellow-orange tree. He just knows from the color wheel, the color is going to be a dark yellow-orange, but he wants to make it cool. So adding a little bit of violet to it and getting the right value so it looks dark compared to these lights in the background. Nothing is so planned out and color isn't so stale that you have a formula for everything you see. Again, if artists were to repaint their paintings, the colors would look different because you don't come up with the same color sense every time you paint. But you do use the same basic ideas of what works and what doesn't. Simplifying the shapes, getting right, simple values, and then thinking color temperature, which is what he does here to suggest sunlight. All these cool shadows. Again, it doesn't matter what color he uses, but the values have to be right. Lighter, flat plane, darker, vertical plane. Then the only thing he has to worry about color-wise is making it cooler in the shadow. warmer in the sunlight. Now that doesn't mean you can't have warm colors in the shadow. He's got yellow-orange trees, but he has to make that yellow-orange look cool or make it cooler compared to the warmer sunlit yellow oranges in the background. So it's more of a comparison than anything else. You can have oranges down here in the shadow as long as they're darker and cooler than any orange like in here that's in the sunlight. There's some sunlit oranges in there. So again, it's more of a comparison idea of comparing warm against cool and dark against light. But what we want to think is in terms of how to think about color and value. That way we come up with different ideas about color, sometimes for the same thing, but it's the ideas of thinking about value and color, to simplify it, thinking in terms of temperature instead of local color all the time. And this is Frederick Malhaupt, again, late 19th century East Coast painter. What makes his painting so strong is the strong separation of the warm and the cool here, sunlight and the shadow on the trees. And all the brush variation in here, it's showing the form of those kind of rolling flat plain area in there, that rolling ground. Some color variation in there, color variation in the leaves, even in the sky. But if we look at it black and white, the values are really simple. 2 or 3 values in the shadow on the ground down here, maybe 3 or 4 values in the trees, 2 to 3 values in the sky. Very, very simple, but it's that color variation that makes it work. And again, doesn't have to use these colors. He could make these trees yellow, green, blue, green. We're thinking in terms of the color wheel. But we get caught up in the colors they come up with in here. And I'm speaking from experience. I was so caught up in just how to match color that I saw that I really had trouble mixing color, because I thought I had to come up with the same colors that I see in others' paintings or in life. But again, it's learning the process of how to think and see. And the color is just a choice. And that choice can vary from painting to painting. But you can see that definite shadow pattern in here on the light, or the shadow side of the light area of the foliage. And that simple dark and light pattern in the darks of the trees down here using the sky holes. But it's the simplicity that makes this work. Now there is some detail, obviously. Little darks and lights of the sky holes, darks and lights of the different sizes of the limbs and branches and tree trunks. But it's really reduced from what he was probably seeing. And it's that contrast of warm against cool color that makes things vibrate. And he does have a lot of color variation in here and in here in the foreground. But that disappears when you look at it in black and white. Subtle color change, but it's there. Now this is an artist, Joseph N. King, again another East Coast artist, late 19th century. And he started out as a tonalist. In other words, his colors were always secondary to the tone. He wanted a dark tone, a moody time of day, usually towards late afternoon to late evening, where everything is more tonal than it is color-wise. Of course, the color here is pretty strong for a tonalist painter. But as he developed, he turned into an impressionist, very bright colors. Here he's using more earth colors, more black, so the color doesn't have as much punch. But again, the values and shapes are simplified. He does have a lot of color variation, because if we look at this in black and white, you can see there's not much value change. A couple of values, maybe 3 in the background trees, probably 3 values in the flat front foreground. Skies, maybe a couple of values. So there's not a lot of value change, which is what detail is. But he does have a lot of color change. He just uses more earth colors to affect his colors, leaving the reds to stand out a little bit stronger. But even the reds here are muted. They're just not muted as much as the background trees. Now this is another Frederick Malhaupt, East Coast painter. Very strong color, but these shapes, which we see as kind of picky or detailed because of all the color change in there, a lot of different colors, a lot of small brush strokes, but when we look at it black and white, there's very little value change. And that's what keeps it simple. So make more changes with color change that are the same value and use less value change, which makes things look more picky. This is more value change in here. A lot of little darks and lights to suggest the brickwork. See how simple he keeps the background trees, the sky. Everything looks a lot more simple in the black and white, and it's the variation of color that makes the difference. Now, it's still the value of the color that makes it work. So value is still more important than color, but it's that subtle color variation, same value, different color for these big shapes, that makes things vibrate. And that's why it's so important. I keep stressing these thumbnail drawings, because the thumbnail drawings will force you to see things in more simple terms of just big, simple dark and light. Now this is a Chauncey Ryder painting, and he started out as a tonalist too, very dark, moody, earth colors, a lot of black, and became very impressionistic. But I like his application of paint here. He's not a slick painter. He applies it any way he wants because it's more the color relationships and value relationships that make this painting so nice. And again, looking at the value, not a lot of value variation. Very simple values, but a lot of color variation. He gets a lot of color going in here. And I don't think he saw these colors, but he thought these colors worked the best to suggest what he was seeing. And he did a lot of these kind of smaller outdoor sketches I think are really nice. They're not slick, things aren't rendered perfectly, but it has a real nice feel to it because he's thinking more about shape, value, and color temperature. You can see compositionally, your eye comes in on this line between the road and the grass, follows up here, hits this line, goes up here, and really you can just wind around all day long here on this. Your eye can follow a lot of those lines and at least lead you throughout the painting. I know art collectors or people that view art, that like art, really don't know this. But as the painter, as the artist, you can set your painting up to guide the viewer how to look through your painting. And that's why the composition is so important. Now, this is another painting by T.C. Steele. And this was the earlier painting by T.C. Steele. A little more muted colors, more natural, realistic colors. And here he's really pushing the color. And there's a lot of variation of color in the sky and the trees, this flat plane in here. And he keeps the color real strong. Although I think everything is slightly muted. He just doesn't mute things very much. But there's not much in this painting that's pure color, like it looks. It looks like the blue is almost straight from the tube with white. There's a spot or two of these kind of red oranges or maybe some greens or blues back in there. But everything is slightly muted. That way he can decide where he wants the strongest color. And it looks like it's in these trees, maybe a little bit of the blue. So this area becomes more the focal point, and that's where the strongest color is. And again, value-wise, not a lot of big value changes. Values are fairly simple. A lot of contrast here between the values, between the barn and the trees. But values, shapes are simple. It's the color that makes it stand out. So another Aldro Hibbard. Again, you can follow where he wants the viewer to look coming in here. Fence, and you can just wind around, pick up these lines that can just carry you all over the painting and back out again. And he always does a good job of that. And then value-wise, it looks a lot less busy because the busyness comes from the color variation in these trees, the different color variations in the hillside, but they're real close value or same value. So it looks a lot more simple in the black and white, but a lot of color variation. This orange really stands out from the hills, the green hills and the yellow tree. But when we look at the black and white, there's really hardly any value contrast. It's the intensity and the color variation of the orange against the green and warm against the cool that makes that work. Well, let me know if you have any questions about anything on this. Autumn colors or autumn time of year is a good time for painting, not just because of the color variation, but you can use colors to simplify, or you can use the colors to add some punch to the painting and keep the values really simple. Because in the summer, everything gets to be just variations of green. But in the fall, you can really push the idea of the color, but still keep the values simple.